What's going on, guys? In today's video, I thought that I would talk a little bit about what my experience was growing up as a Christian homeschooler. Now, in today's day and age when a lot of people are homeschooled because of COVID, it's not nearly as unusual to be homeschooled. But when I was growing up, it was a lot more unusual and considered a lot more uncool. A lot of the time I'd be asked by people, "Oh, so you're homeschooled?" And people would be like, "Oh, dude, I'm so sorry about that. Like, that really sucks." And a lot of people didn't realize that I was homeschooled until I specifically told them, because I didn't act like a complete social outcast and I didn't act like, a dork. And that's kind of a stigma or a stereotype that comes with a lot of homeschooled kids, is that they're very sheltered, they're very socially awkward, they're just weird. And I'm not gonna lie, there were a lot of instances where being homeschooled ended up getting me a lot more negative attention than I would have cared for. But I'm gonna tell you guys in this video why I believe that being homeschooled is a must. My kids are going to be homeschooled come heck or high water, and I think that you should homeschool your kids because it's way too much of a risk. Your kids are the most important thing that you are ever going to be responsible for, and you can't afford to mess them up, no matter what the cost, what the circumstances. Of course, sometimes both parents have to work and there isn't really a way that you can escape sending your kid off to school, but if it's at all possible, I would try to convince you to homeschool your kids. So when I was really young, I went to kindergarten and first grade for like a few weeks of first grade, actually. Public school. And the reason that we actually ended up pulling me out of public school initially was because I was such an anxious and such a nervous kid that being in a classroom with a bunch of kids that I didn't really know very well made me so unbelievably nervous. And I would have days where I just, for whatever reason, I just couldn't help myself. I cried, or I just absolutely hated it, and I dreaded going to school. And a lot of that was because we ended up finding out that I was really low on certain things like magnesium and stuff like that. So I ended up being homeschooled from about first grade on all throughout high school. And my parents didn't make the mistake of not involving me in any sort of sports, not involving me in any sort of social interaction. I ended up playing a lot of football, a lot of basketball, and just various other sports and activities that ended up getting me out to meet a lot of other kids my age. Probably my very worst experience being homeschooled, or just experience because I was homeschooled, was because when I played football or when I played middle school basketball for those first few years, when those kids were not quite used to a homeschooled kid being around, and just kind of all of the like I said, the stereotypes that surround homeschooled kids, they looked at me like I was some sort of just bizarre creature, basically. So when I was playing football, I remember all of the kids absolutely hating me because I was just so different. I mean, I dressed differently. Now, my parents didn't do me any favors exactly, but I didn't really care about those things being homeschooled, because in public school, you're just, all of these insecurities and all these doubts about yourself and the way that you're dressed and the way that you come off, all of those doubts and insecurities are just pounded into your head because all you're doing is spending time with kids your age. And what I can tell you, and one of the big reasons that I'm going to homeschool my kids, is that if you entrust your kids to all those students and all those teachers in a public school, if your kid spends 60 or 70% of their waking hours, if not more, with their fellow classmates and with their teachers, guess whose influence and guess who's going to be the primary driving force of raising your child? It's not going to be you. It's going to be those people. So As long as you're totally okay with the risks associated with letting a bunch of other people raise your kid for you primarily, then go ahead, do public school. But if you want more control over what your kid gets exposed to and how your kid gets exposed to it, then I would recommend that you do as much of the schooling of your kids as you possibly can. At the very least, try to find a good Christian private school to get your kids involved in, because it's not worth losing your kid's soul because you don't know exactly how to school your kid, or you just feel like it would be a huge hassle. So about middle school age was probably one of the absolute hardest ages for me. You know, that kind of level of emotional maturity when you're middle school age is pretty darn bad, and then you throw someone into the mix that's completely different than all of the other kids. I mean, I didn't cuss or swear for the most part leading up to that age whatsoever. I dressed in, I wasn't like a total dork, but the clothing that I wore was just a little bit different, maybe a few years behind, and I didn't fit in. I didn't know anyone, and in that middle school age, kids are so insecure and they're trying to fit into their little cliques and their little groups. And I didn't really fit into any of them. So I just found myself feeling so unbelievably alone, and already I was an anxious kid. So it really ended up messing with me, and I made a lot of enemies. I'm kind of a bit of a confrontational guy in general, despite my anxiety and my nervousness. And so I ended up butting heads with a lot of people. And unfortunately, some of those people were kind of popular amongst the other kids. And so I ended up making quite a bit of enemies at a very young age. But it's just like Jesus said, they hated him before and they're going to hate you. So if we are different from the world, then we should expect a little bit of resistance. We're called to be the salt and the light of this world. We're called to be different. And I'm not saying that I was being a fantastic disciple or anything at 12 or 13 years old, but I was definitely different from the other kids. Fast forward a little bit to high school, and I transferred over to my old school that I played basketball for. I was homeschooled, but I played for a public middle school. I transferred over to that school's arch rival for high school basketball. I was hoping that transferring over would maybe lead to me being around some nicer people, because my brother had played middle school basketball for this other school, and I was thinking, oh, well, those kids seem to be nice, so maybe the high school class is also nice.
You're wrong.
Well, I was partially correct, but the senior class was not quite so nice. I had times where I was pantsed during practices. I heard lots of stories of freshmen having other really horrible things happen to them. I probably had such a reputation as a kid that didn't really know the rules of public school that they probably were afraid to do that to me. Plus, I didn't actually go to class with those kids, so there weren't nearly as many opportunities to mess with me. But the senior class at my high school was absolutely horrible. Made me rethink again playing any sort of sports. I actually tried to quit, but my parents would not let me quit, and I'm very glad that they did that they didn't allow me to do that, because if I had quit, I never would have played college basketball, and I never would have all of the self-confidence and charisma that I have now. I feel like I would have been a completely different person. So thank you, Mom and Dad, for that one. I can tell you that past Sam was not thanking my parents, though, because I remember one day trying to run away from home, and I remember it coming about time to go to practice and me telling my mom that I was not going to go to practice. But she said basically that if I didn't go to practice, or that if I decided that I wasn't going to go to practice, that she would have my dad load me up into the car and then we'd drive there. So I ended up begrudgingly going to practice, and God smiling down on me for somewhat being obedient to my parents, I guess, had that day's practice canceled, I believe, anyway. So I was so unbelievably thankful to God for that. But yeah, the first few years of middle school and high school were definitely rough for me because I was so different. And not different in a dorky or nerdy way, even though I'm sure that I was kind of dorky compared to a lot of those other kids. But the main reason that I was so different was because I didn't do things like cuss all the time. I didn't do things like talk about a bunch of really awful and heinous like sexual things. I didn't enjoy talking about the same things that they enjoyed talking about. To this day, people still think that I'm about 5 or 6 years older than I actually am because I have really good and sophisticated adult conversations with people that are way older than me because that's the only kind of people that I've really related to throughout my entire life. I'm an old soul, basically. I like to talk about things that really matter, not so much about what some guy did at a party or how fine some lady is or whatever. I'm in general way more interested in talking about things that are, I don't know, important. So while I might have gotten a lot of trouble when I was initially growing up, when I was first going through all of those middle school and high school awkward phases, before I was really confident in myself and before I really just didn't care about what those kids thought of me, it was definitely a tough growing process. I wouldn't want to have to go through it again, but I can tell you that I would not want to do it any differently. I don't know what I would have ended up being like if I had gone through public school, if I had been just like those other kids, because to be honest, a lot of those other kids, while they might not be quite as immature and quite as awful as they were back then, a lot of those kids are still really, really far from God. And you want to talk about something that instills a lot of doubt and a lot of pain and just not wanting to trust God with your life. Put them through years and years of public school and being beaten down and seeing a bunch of horrible things happen, hearing nothing but people talking about just awful, godless stuff. And you're going to have an adult that doesn't trust God, that doesn't understand why God would put them in the kind of situation that they're in, that sees and looks around at their peers and sees no one else trusts in God, no one else is living a godly lifestyle, and decides to themselves, why in the world would I follow God? Why would I do things differently than everybody else in my school, in my class? And that's something that I would caution you against allowing to happen. No matter how easy it might be to allow your kids to go off to public school, I can tell you that unless you have an incredibly strong child, they're very likely going to face a lot of side effects and symptoms of going to public school. Now, I am by no means saying that I'm perfect. And trust me, I deal with a lot of the same issues that kids from public school deal with, but it's given me a level of emotional maturity and a closeness to God and a closeness to my family, to my parents, to my brother and sister that I never would have had if I was public schooled. Public school is eat or be eaten. It's either join up with the cool and popular crowds, go the way that the road is pointing, or you can walk that narrow path. And it's kind of a lot like a metaphor for our Christian lives. It's a lot more difficult in some ways socially to be homeschooled, and a lot more difficult to go through kind of being seen as a little bit of a social outcast in some situations. But I can tell you that you'll come out the other side not at all regretting that. As long as you make sure that your kid still does social stuff, still does sports or an activity or just something to get them out of the house and with other kids their age. I just can't stress how important it is for you to be the main teacher of your child, for you to be the main influence on your child. Because if you let your child be raised by those wolves out there, those other kids their age, guess who your kid's gonna end up being like. Anyway, guys, I hope that you enjoyed this video. This is just a little bit of my testimony about me being a Christian homeschooled kid. If you guys have any questions about what it was like for me growing up being a Christian homeschooler, I would be happy to answer any sort of comments that you guys have. So leave a comment down below. Please like and subscribe. Share this video if you want to talk to somebody else about homeschooling potentially. I love every single one of you guys, and I will see you in the next video. Thanks, guys.